You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Tevi Troy, PhD. He has an incredibly amazing career, still going strong, and has written some terrific books. If you love presidential history, White House history, you need to pick these up. His latest is Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump, which the Wall Street Journal listed as one of the 5 best political books of 2020. Dr. Troy is a best-selling presidential historian, former White House aide, and Deputy Secretary of Health. He's also a one-time Indianapolis resident, and we're going to talk to him about that. His other books are Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted, 200 Years of Popular Culture in the White House. He's the author of more than 300 articles, and they've appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, and many other publications. Tevi, thank you very much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Hey, thanks, Robert. Really appreciate it. And I just love that title, Leaders and Legends. And you don't talk about small things when you've got Leaders and Legends on the docket.
Well, quite frankly, we got lucky. It was it was sullied by the Big Ten and their divisions several years ago. But when I went to find a name for the podcast, that was available. Shocking. And to be candid, a lot of the folks that we've had on the podcast have fit that description, whether it's Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who climbed aboard the Kennedy limousine in Dallas in November of '63, Governor Mitch Daniels, Mayor Greg Ballard. We've also been lucky to have some historians on, and we're glad that you're joining the ranks. Kate Anderson Brower was on our podcast, and
I read her book.
It was terrific. Craig Fairman, who's a buddy of yours.
Terrific guy.
So let's talk a little bit about your career before we talk about your forays into authorship. At a certain point, I'm guessing you got turned on by politics. How young were you when that happened? And do you have some first kind of political memory as you got through the process of growing up and getting an education?
Yeah, I grew up in New York in the 1970s, which your listeners may not remember was a big mess. I mean, we talk about problems that we face today, and there are some problems, but New York in the 1970s was a disaster. Blackouts, crime, graffiti, dysfunction. The city went bankrupt. In fact, one of the famous headlines from that era was when Gerald Ford refused to do a federal bailout of New York City. The headline in the Daily News was "Ford to NY, drop dead." And it was a legend. So you want to talk about a legend? That's a legendary headline.
You grew up in the city.
I grew up in Queens.
Okay.
But I went to school in Manhattan, so I had to take the subway every day, which was dicey. And I looked around and I said, God, there's got to be a better way. I mean, I had great love for this country. And, I know my parents and their ancestors escaped from Europe, and it would have been good to stay there. And so I really felt very strongly about this country and what the promise of this country is. But I also saw that things weren't working. And so I got interested in getting involved in politics. I worked in a very minor junior voluntary capacity for the Reagan campaign in 1984 when I was still in high school. And then I moved to Washington after I graduated college and got involved in working at think tanks. I worked at the American Enterprise Institute. And that's where I really got the bug about the writing game and how thinkers can help influence leaders and legends and how they can help shape the direction of policy.
New York City in the 1970s is the decade of John Lindsay, Abraham Beame. I'm not sure when Koch came in.
1977.
Is that when he first won in 77?
Yep.
But it's also the decade, and you were there when Son of Sam was rampaging through the city. December, I believe, 1980, when John Lennon was shot. Do you remember those historical events, and do you remember the effect they had on the city?
Oh, absolutely. My brother is older than I, and he kind of had long hair. And my mom, I remember, was nervous that he might get shot by Son of Sam, because Son of Sam would shoot couples in cars. And one of the things was that he would shoot guys. They thought that he would shoot a couple if the guy had long hair. I don't know if it's exactly true, but that, they were looking for any clues they could find on that. So that was very distressing. And there's actually a legendary story about Abe Beame, who is called to police headquarters, and he's in the midst of this very tight Democratic primary, and he's in a real difficult situation for re-election. And he goes down to police headquarters one night because he hears that they've captured Son of Sam. And he sees this kind of scruffy guy with a olive army jacket that people wear in the 70s, and he thinks that is the plainclothes detective who broke the case. And he goes to shake the man's hand to see photographers all snap pictures. And David Garth, who was his media consultant, called it the photo op from hell. And I thought that moment really summed up the New York City in the 70s.
Say that story again, just very quickly. We had a connection issue. Please, Abraham Beame goes to the police station.
So Abe Beame goes to police headquarters. He's called and he's told that they've captured the Son of Sam. And he's in this very difficult re-election campaign. So he really needs the PR boost. And he goes to police headquarters and he sees this kind of scruffy guy with an olive drab jacket. And he thinks that this guy is the plainclothes detective who broke the case. And he goes to shake his hand only to be greeted by the manacled hands of David Berkowitz, Son of Sam himself. And he shakes hands with the mayor. And David Garth, who was the mayor's PR consultant, his media guru, said it was the photo op from hell.
And did Mayor Beame win that election?
No, he lost in this very tight primary where he was up against Ed Koch, who won, Mario Cuomo, who went on to become governor, and his son is now governor, and Bella Abzug, who was kind of the darling of the feminist left. So it was a very crowded Democratic primary in 1977.
Which, if you could choose a TV series that most accurately portrays New York City, which would you choose?
Well, at the time in the 70s, I happened to love The Odd Couple with Felix and Oscar and the kind of messy roommate and the neat roommate. And the interesting thing about it is it really does capture something about New York City in the 70s. Crime is a constant feature in that show. They get mugged, their apartments robbed, their cars vandalized. It's a constant thing. And then if you look at a TV show in New York in the 90s, let's say Friends or Seinfeld, there's occasional mentions of mugging, but it's very rare. You don't see their apartments getting broken into. You don't see them scared to walk down the street. There's a real shift in New York between the 70s and the 90s.
Rudy Giuliani has taken some hits, I think it's fair to say, based on his service to now former President Donald Trump. But what Giuliani was able to do to New York City in the 90s is simply amazing. I don't have any frame of reference because I'm not from there and I didn't spend any time there, but just the impact he had. And obviously I think we should give credit to Mayor Bloomberg, who came behind him. What did you think, or what do you think of Giuliani's performance just as mayor?
Yeah, well, first of all, the turnaround started with Ed Koch, who started saying we're going to punish criminals. And then David Dinkins wins against Koch, and he has this softer approach towards criminals, and New York City really goes into a tailspin in the Dinkins years. And Giuliani, who lost the first time to Dinkins, then runs again, defeats Dinkins, and he brings in all these smart ideas from places like the Manhattan Institute about community policing and keeping statistics and the broken windows theory. And these things worked. I know there's a movement these days to criticize them or debunk them. But the truth is they worked, they helped New York City turn around, and it was palpable. You felt it. New York City was a safer place to be. And in fact, after the 1990s, I used to walk across Central Park, and I realized even though I spent my whole life in New York, I didn't know my way through Central Park. And the reason was because I'd never entered Central Park in the 70s and 80s because it wasn't safe to do so.
Where were you on September 11th, 2001, and what were your reactions as you saw your hometown being attacked?
Well, I was a political appointee in the George W. Bush administration. I was working at the Department of Labor, and I saw the first plane hit, and I said, wow, that's weird. Why would a plane do that? I thought it was some kind of accident. And there had been an incident where a plane, I guess, almost hit the Empire State Building years before. But it wasn't anything that happened because air traffic control had improved. And then when the next one hit, it was like a blow to the stomach. And I remember I had to walk home that day because the traffic was shut down in Washington. The metro was shut down. My walk home was only about 3 miles. I knew people who walked 10, 12 miles to get home that day. It was a total mess. And I realized we were just in a new era. And you asked earlier, I didn't really answer the question about Giuliani. And look, he's obviously discredited today, and the things he did in the Trump administration, especially towards the end, are just unforgivable. But in September of 2001, that guy was an American hero. And it really tells you something, how you just have to manage and care for and tend to your reputation. And if you do things that damage your reputation, it could damage the good work of a lifetime.
You received your PhD in American Civilization from the University of Texas. What does that mean, American civilization?
It's a multidisciplinary approach to history. I wanted to learn American history, but I also was interested in culture. I was interested in politics. And in fact, I wrote a book about the intersection of culture and politics. It's called What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted. I also wrote my dissertation, which became my first book, about intellectuals in the American presidency. So I was really interested in how culture affects our presidents, our polity, and our governance. And University of Texas has great programs in American civilization, in history, in government. I took a lot of classes with the LBJ school, and then also in culture. So it was a really good combination of interests that brought me to Texas, and I was very glad I was there. And then later when I moved to Washington and the George W. Bush administration comes, it was a plus to have a PhD from the University of Texas.
I bet. I've always felt that in terms of pure intelligence among the American presidents, it's hard to beat John Quincy Adams. Now, that was a long time ago. He was the sixth president, so you're talking a couple hundred years. But how important has just raw intellect been not only to successful candidacies, but successful presidencies? And I say that, of course, in John Quincy Adams only one time.
Yeah, and he didn't win the majority of the popular vote the first time. And he didn't win a majority of the electoral vote either. He won a plurality of the electoral vote and then defeated Andrew Jackson in what was known as the corrupt bargain. So intelligence helps. Sure, certainly you don't want to have dumb presidents. But I think about I would agree that John Quincy Adams was probably the smartest president of the 19th century. Jefferson would be up there too. But the smartest president of the 20th century was Jimmy Carter. Didn't have a great tenure either. Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer. I mean, the guy was, he was not dumb by any means, but he was a micromanager, and he just didn't know how to run the presidency. In fact, there's a great legendary joke that Ronald Reagan has a dream in 1980, and in the dream, Jimmy Carter comes to him and says, "Ronnie, why do you want my job?" And Reagan says, "I don't want your job, Jimmy. I want to be president."
He was seen as a micromanager, but how much of that is of Jimmy Carter's reputation? The famous story is obviously that he scheduled the White House tennis court, but how much of that is overrated and how much of that is accurate?
So on the tennis courts, there are different aides who will say different things. James Fallows, who famously reported that story in The Atlantic, swears by it, but Stu Eisenstadt, who was a closer aide to Carter, denies it. But either way, it really did fit into this perception of Carter as a micromanager. And one of his cabinet secretaries, Joe Califano, did say that Jimmy Carter is the highest paid assistant secretary of planning in the government because he would get involved in the writing of legislation. And that is not questioned. That's not a controversial claim. And I think it does prove that Carter was a micromanager. He didn't want to have a chief of staff. He wanted to be involved in the niggling details, and I think it hurt him.
In contrast that, which if people listening are old enough to remember, was as Clark Clifford, who was Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson and was close to Truman. He ended up getting, I think, indicted, but maybe not convicted. I can't remember in financial irregularities case in the 80s. Famously referred to Ronald Reagan as an amiable dunce. Yet Ronald Reagan won 489 electoral votes in 1980 and 525 in 1984. So when you are perceived or accused of being not intellectual, does that mean that you're also underestimated and therefore have a greater chance of success?
Oh, I think that there is something to that. Look, I think there's a bias against Republican presidents and that there's this perception that they're all dumb. People said that Eisenhower was dumb and Ford was dumb and Reagan was dumb and George W. Bush was dumb. They can't all have been dumb. It's just not true. It's just not possible. But I think Reagan especially and Eisenhower did like this idea of being underestimated. And George W. Bush, too, he said he gets misunderestimated is the famous funny line. And I think that there's a story about Reagan that one time he's reading a serious work of nonfiction. And his press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, comes to him and he says, "Mr. President, I'd like to let the press know that you're reading this book so they think that you're not reading Louis L'Amour novels all the time." And Reagan says, I don't think we need to do that, Marlin, because Reagan wanted to convey the sense that he was a man of the people. And he was plenty smart and he read lots of books, but he didn't want to appear airy or above the people. He wanted to be one of the people. I think Eisenhower did the same thing too.
In your litany of Republican presidents in the last half of the 20th century who were perceived as unintelligent, I noticed you omitted Nixon, whom I think is one of the most brilliant, perhaps misguided, presidents we've ever had. No one, as I recall, in all the books I've read about him, have ever questioned his intelligence, but rather his motives and judgment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I pointedly left Nixon out, and you caught me. And as you were supposed to. I'm not trying to play to hide the ball or anything. But Nixon, the people who hated him did not accuse him of being dumb. They just accused him of being evil.
Who was it who said of Franklin Roosevelt, he has a second-class intellect but a first-class temperament? Did I get that quote correct?
You did get that quote correct, and it was a Supreme Court justice.
It was Supreme Court justice, yeah. Yes.
Was it Brandeis? No, not Brandeis.
But
regardless, it was one of the Supreme Court justices.
Regardless, it might have been Jackson, Robert Jackson. Anyway, moving on. Do you agree with that statement?
I mean, supposedly Roosevelt got a gentleman's C at Harvard, so he wasn't necessarily somebody who was hitting the books all the time. But he did know how to work with people. He knew how to comfort the American people. The radio addresses were a great way of getting over the heads of the media and speaking directly to the people. So he was clearly a very savvy politician. I didn't list him as one of the smartest presidents of the 20th century because I don't think he was, but he was certainly a very smart and savvy politician.
Well, unless I believe it's still true that Woodrow Wilson is the only president to have earned a PhD. Yet his reputation is in the midst of a hailstorm. What do you think of Wilson's intellect? And by any standard, he was an inveterate racist, and he's being canceled somewhat these days. And the Leaders and Legends podcast, we try not to stray into politics because it's really not the point of it. But what are your feelings as someone who've worked in federal government, have studied presidents, that we are now judging these men 80, 100, 200 years later?
George W. Bush, for whom I worked, used to say, when asked about his historical reputation, he said, "They're still writing books about the first George W. So I'll let history be the judge." And I think that I think Wilson is a very interesting test case, because what you've had in recent years is there were presidents who got kind of reevaluated. Think about Eisenhower when Fred Greenstein wrote The Hidden Hand Presidency. and he got an improvement in what his reputation was. Similarly with Truman in the McCulloch book. So sometimes these presidents are raised in the estimation of historians and then later the public by later scholarship. With Wilson, he's been taking hits. I think they're appropriate hits. I think there are plenty of people who thought Wilson was problematic even beforehand. He clearly was a racist. There's no doubt about that. I think he was also dishonest. And I think that as somebody who studied how presidents deal with disasters and wrote a book about how presidents deal with disasters and even a chapter on pandemics, I mean, Wilson and his reaction to the Spanish flu of 1918 was just horrific. I mean, he really did nothing. He tried to suppress information about it from going around. He obviously didn't have the tools that we have today, so it would be unfair to judge him on today's standards. But 650,000 Americans died in that flu. The average life expectancy went down by a decade. And this current coronavirus that we're going through is obviously quite terrible. But the deaths are disproportionately among the elderly with this coronavirus. In that one, they were disproportionately among the young. And so it had an even greater impact on our country and our society. And Wilson was definitely found wanting in that situation.
Why the young?
It had to do with the immune systems. The stronger your immune system was, the stronger its reaction to the virus, and that the immune system overreaction, if you will, ended up killing people.
We're talking to Tevi Troy. Used to work at the White House, was Deputy Secretary of Health, but he's on today to talk about his books. We just finished talking about his book about intellectuals and the American presidency. By any stretch of the imagination, Lincoln did not have much of a formal education, but was intuitively brilliant and uncommonly wise. Where would you put him in the pantheon of intellectuals and the presidency?
Yeah, well, one thing you'd have to add with Lincoln was that he was incredibly widely read also. Even as a young boy, there are stories about him walking miles to get a book, and he would read books over and over again. And he practically memorized the King James Bible. He knew Shakespeare incredibly well. If there was a book anywhere within reach, he was going to be getting it and reading it and absorbing it. He knew Aesop's fables cold. So I think Lincoln was really one of the top intellects we've had as president, one of the best writers, as our mutual friend Craig Furman has talked about. And it's true he didn't have a formal education. Harry Truman also, he's the last president not to go to college, but he was a real autodidact. And it's a great thing that you can learn your way to learning and make your way to learning via reading. And it's not just getting a fancy university education that gets you there. Just one point of clarification, my book, Intellectuals in the American Presidency, is really a look at the White House aides who were intellectuals who served presidents, and not necessarily the presidents themselves who were intellectuals. And so it starts with the era of the White House staff. And so it really goes from Kennedy and all the way. I wrote it in the Bush. I finished it in the Bush administration. So that's where it goes to.
Is it safe to say at the apex of people, of intellectuals who worked in the White House, would sit Daniel Patrick Moynihan?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he's on the cover of my book, Intellectuals in the American Presidency. He served in the Nixon administration, very smart guy, had a PhD. He was a Democrat serving in a Republican administration. And interestingly, he used to write memos to Nixon saying that I'm serving as your intellectual, but you need to develop and cultivate Republican intellectuals. You can't always count on a Democrat to do it for you. And what you saw in the Reagan White House was suddenly you had this explosion of think tank people serving in the administration, not just in kind of this White House intellectual position that I talked about. Marty Anderson, I argue, had that role, but people up and down in line positions at the agencies and throughout the White House. Lots of intellectuals served in the Reagan administration, and they were just inspired by Reagan's intellectual conservative message.
I just ordered actually I didn't order it because I already have it, but a book on Kissinger as a political figure. Did you get the sense that Kissinger brought a new level of intellectual heft and prominence to the role of Secretary of State?
Oh, absolutely. The previous intellectuals that I studied, such as Arthur Schlesinger, he served in the White House as kind of intellectual gadfly. he wasn't really in a line position. He helped out with speeches and he did some liaison work, but he wasn't doing hardcore policy work, kind of like Kissinger was at National Security Council and then later as Secretary of State. And he was actually both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State at the same time, the only man to hold both roles at the same time. So yeah, Kissinger definitely brought the sense that you can get a PhD and go to Washington and do all these types of jobs. And it was one of the inspirations for me in terms of getting a PhD and then going to work in Washington when I did end up working in the White House.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that your family fled Europe. Please tell us a little more about that.
So both of my parents, my mom has passed this year, but my dad's still with us. Both my parents were born in America, but all four of the grandparents spoke with accents. None of them were born in America. They came from Russia and or Poland. And my grandfather was actually drafted or force drafted, I guess, into the Polish army in World War I. And at one point, his unit was being deployed to the front. And he hid under a table when they were deployed and then escaped from Poland in some kind of hay cart and made it to Canada. And that whole unit that was deployed to the front, I'm sure they were wiped out because it was not a good place to be in World War I. So I think there's a real recognition that by coming to America, we found a new promise for the Troy family, and I'm grateful to America for that.
Another book that you've written is Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. How prepared generally are White Houses, Oval Office, presidents, their staff for disasters, and how did you qualify an event as a disaster for your book?
It's a great question. Let me take the second part first, which is if, let's say, there's a pileup on I-70 and 5 people die, it's a tragedy, but it's not a disaster. It doesn't have ripple effects that go beyond the locality of the event. So what I was talking about with disasters were things that were of national import. So 9/11 is something that affected the whole nation. Coronavirus, obviously something that affects the whole nation. And those are the kinds of things that I was trying to look at in the book. I think for the most part, administrations are not prepared. I give advice in the book for how to be better prepared. And I think that you need to do these tabletop and gaming exercises to make sure you know what your role is when a disaster happens. But it's very hard to be fully prepared. I think you can have a strategic national stockpile like we do, and you can have a flu plan like we do, and still be caught in the coronavirus disaster. So with respect to coronavirus specifically, the strategic national stockpile, in which we spend over $500 million maintaining every year, it's supposed to have all these countermeasures for a variety of diseases. It is useless if when the disaster strikes, you don't have a countermeasure that works for that particular pathogen. And that's what happened with coronavirus. We didn't have a vaccine or an antiviral that worked for it. We have vaccines for flu, and we have antivirals for flu, and for a whole host of other diseases. I can't really get into the specifics of it because it's classified, but we just didn't have what we needed for coronavirus. And it showed, and 400,000 Americans are dead, and it's a really difficult situation. And this is despite the fact that in the Bush administration, President Bush said we need to be prepared for this kind of thing, and did come up with a flu plan and did help bolster the national stockpile. So you can have preparations done, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be prepared.
Is part of the problem the fact that you're just so busy managing the day-to-day and the tactical problems that come up that it's hard to make time for the sort of long-range planning that's required in disaster management?
I think there's something to that. And, I know there was some noise during the first impeachment trial of Trump that you're taking the president's attention on this. And this is why when coronavirus was already starting to emerge, and Tom Cotton, I know, talked about it on the Senate floor. I think presidents are focused on the immediacy of the now, and sometimes they lose sight of the preparation work that's kind of less sexy, doesn't make headlines. And you don't know if you're doing preparation for hurricanes and you get hit with a flu, then it seems like it's wasted effort. And vice versa, if you're working on flu and the hurricane hits, it seems like it was wasted effort. So it's very hard to be a winner in preparation. But preparation allows you to be a winner when a disaster strikes.
Which president handled which disaster the best?
I actually have in the appendix of Shall We Wake the President, a list of the 5 best presidents at handling disaster. And let me just say, I give Bill Clinton high marks there for the famous millennium bug, where people talked about Y2K and our computer systems might go down. And he spent a lot of time and resources working on federal, state, and local efforts to make sure that our code was up to speed so that we wouldn't have complete and major crashes when the millennium started in 2000. The basic gist of this was that our computer systems were prepared for 2 digits, 98, 99, but it didn't know what to do with 4 digits, meaning the year 2000, and they thought there might be some major crashes there. So Clinton worked with the federal government, he worked with the state and locals, but he also worked with the private sector to make sure that they were ready for it. And there was no millennium bug disaster. Now, for all we know, it might never have happened. Maybe the preparatory efforts were not helpful. But I think he put a lot of effort into making sure that we were prepared and that we weren't going to be caught by surprise by it. So prevention is usually the best in this case. So I give Clinton high marks in that regard.
Yeah, the Y2K drama seems like many, many lifetimes ago compared to what we've encountered since then. Was there a time when the president was not awakened when he should have been?
Yeah, I mean, the title of the book, Shall We Wake the President, really comes from this ad that Hillary Clinton did about Obama in 2016, where she shows a phone ringing at 3 a.m. and who do you want there to answer the phone? And it was a kind of a knock on Obama's youth and inexperience. But this whole idea of waking the president and did you wake him, should you have woken him, really comes from an incident in 1981 when these 2 F-14 U.S. jets shot down 2 Libyan MiG fighters, and the MiGs were Soviet-made planes, but they were being flown by Libyan pilots. And this was late at night, and initially Ed Meese, who was the counselor to the president and was handling the issue, initially did not wake up Reagan because he wanted to get more information. A few hours later, when he had more information, he did wake up Reagan, but the reporters asked, when you heard about this, did you wake Reagan? And he did not. And there was a lot of blowback on that. Nancy Reagan was unhappy with the press, and Ed Meese's rivals in the administration, specifically Jim Baker and Mike Deaver, kind of elbowed him out of his foreign policy responsibilities as a result of his decision not to wake Reagan at that time. And since then, it's been a standard media question. If something happens late at night, did you wake the president?
And it fed the media narrative of Reagan, or the popular perception that he was just kind of lackadaisical and kind of what was the Haynes Johnson book, Sleepwalking Through History, maybe, if I have that quote right, or I have the title right. It kind of fed into a narrative, much like the false claim that George H.W. Bush didn't recognize a grocery store scanner when what he was being shown was a completely different bit of technology. How much does...
to be fair, just one point on that is that Reagan was in his 70s and he was slowing down a bit. And so there is some justification for this concern about this. This was early in his term, so maybe he was around 70.
Well, and he had been shot.
Right, and he had been shot. So there was that. And Nancy Reagan was one of the reasons that Meese was reluctant to wake Reagan was that Nancy was jealously protective of Reagan's sleep, and she wanted to make sure he got naps and that he wasn't interrupted at night and that he got enough hours of sleep. And in fact, she used to constantly say, "I want you horizontal," which kind of became a joke among the White House aides.
Was there a time when the president was awakened and he shouldn't have been? In other words, how important is it that the president himself, or maybe he and the first lady, create a culture where aides do what they have to do?
Yeah, look, there's this famous story of Obama being awakened to be told, and this is early in 29, that he had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And even Obama, when he was awakened, said for what? I mean, he wasn't sure why he won, why he was awakened for it, but why he won the prize, because he just started being president, and it just kind of showed the bias of the Nobel Committee. It wouldn't shock me if Joe Biden wins a Nobel Peace Prize just for not being Trump sometime in the near future.
Is there a blueprint based on your White House experience and federal government experience? Is there a blueprint, a playbook of do's and don'ts of how to manage a disaster? Because I would guess that so much of managing a disaster is climbing aboard a bunch of debris with a bullhorn in your hand. In other words, what George W. Bush did at the rubble of the Twin Towers projected this image of leadership, take charge, we're going to get these guys. How important is the perception, the kind of what the cameras see, and then how important is the back room and all the sort of logistics that happen when you're dealing with a crisis?
Yeah, well, first I would say that there is a blueprint, and it's called Shall We Wake the President? And I have an appendix in there where I give specific advice for presidents on how to handle this, and also specific advice about which kind of disasters you should get involved in and which ones you shouldn't. And also, I specifically list who the best and worst at it. So I would urge all policymakers, people who are going to senior positions of government where disaster is part of your portfolio, to look at Shall We Wake the President? And I happen to know for a fact that there have been heads of Homeland Security and heads of HHS who have had that book on their bookshelf in their office. So that's one thing. But I think you're really right, Robert, to get to this idea of the message and the feelings that a president conveys in times of a disaster. A president doesn't make the vaccine. A president doesn't develop the coronavirus test. A president doesn't drive the boat that picks people up in a flood. But a president communicates to the nation about the extent of the challenge they're facing, teaches them that they shouldn't be panicking, but they should be actually sober-minded about what is ahead of them, and tells them that the federal government is on the job. And if the president's doing those things, they generally are doing a good job with a disaster. And if a president seems to be either giving false information or misleading information or insufficient information, that's when you start to have problems. And so communication is so much an important part of what the president does. And then also behind the scenes, managing the various pieces of the puzzle of federal disaster management.
When managing a disaster, we'll move on to another book I want to discuss of yours. When managing a disaster, how important is it to know when to tell the truth and when not to?
I think you always have to tell the truth. That doesn't mean you have to tell all the information. Doesn't mean you have to reveal classified information. There's that legendary Saturday Night Live skit about Colin Powell in the first Gulf War, where a guy was playing Colin Powell, and the reporters, or the fake reporters, were saying, "So exactly when and where are you going to attack the Iraqis? And what is your battle plan? And can you tell us exactly what time things are going to happen?" And Colin Powell just laughs at them and says, "No, I'm not going to be doing that." So there is a right to know, but there's not necessarily a right to know everything at all times. But if you're president, you've got to tell the truth. And if you don't tell the truth, it really leads to credibility issues. And I think we saw a little bit of this, and this isn't, I'm not putting this on the president, but on the federal government, with the mask issue. The push from the federal public health people in early February and in early March was, don't wear masks, people. And later, they admitted that they were saying don't wear masks because they wanted to save the masks for themselves and the frontline healthcare workers. And then later, when they changed the guidance and said wear masks, people could point to the previous statement and saying don't wear masks and masks don't help. And so I think what they would have been better off saying, look, we have a real crunch on masks, so we want to try and preserve these masks, certainly the N95s for frontline healthcare workers. But if you can come up with alternative masks, or you can fashion a mask, or you can sew a mask, we all encourage you to do that. And I think we wouldn't have had the big mask wars of 2020, which were really an embarrassment without that initial problem.
Speaking of telling the truth, or maybe not opting to do so, was there, in your study of presidents and presidential history, was there ever a point at which Richard Nixon could have told the truth about Watergate and survived?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in some ways, maybe not telling the truth would have helped in terms of if he had just burned all the tapes without disclosing that the tapes existed. Maybe that would have helped. I'm not recommending that was the right thing to have done, but if you're talking about what could have led to his survival, that might have been a better approach. And also, look, if the old story in Washington is not the crime but the cover-up, that gets you. And so if they didn't try and cover it up, I think he would have been in much better shape. So I think there were two things, one positive and one negative that he could have done. Positive, just own up to whatever relationship he had with the plumbers unit early on and say we made a mistake and allow the people who broke into the Watergate to be prosecuted. That would have been one. But the other is later on, before the tapes were released, to just burn them all. And obviously, I'm not recommending burning everything, but I think if you want to talk about two inflection points, how Nixon could have survived, those are two ways he could have done it.
And it was just 4 or 5 months after winning 521 electoral votes, 49 states, that it started to get unraveled with the resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. And I'm going to ask you about that in just a little bit. But for the tape, if you've ever read anything about Nixon or watched sort of the HBO special about it that has actual Nixon recordings, it's amazing that Kissinger didn't know he was being recorded. Pat Nixon didn't know she was being recorded. There were just 3 or 4 of them who knew that the tape system was in existence. And it's astounding to me that they were able to keep that secret until, ironically, future Republican senator and Law and Order star Fred Thompson asked Alexander Butterfield, do you know of any existence of tape? And that just blew the whole thing wide open.
Yeah, although Butterfield fed the information to Fred Dalton Thompson beforehand. So Thompson knew to ask the question.
Like a good lawyer, he knew the answer. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast today is Tevi Troy. He's a PhD. He's written several books. He's worked at the White House and in D.C. and here in Indianapolis. He's been here many times, lived here for a while. Or talk us a little bit about your experience here in Indianapolis and what brought you here.
I was working on my PhD in the early 90s at University of Texas, and I was done with my classwork and my oral exams, which are this very comprehensive exam where you have to read hundreds of books in a year and then 4 professors test you on them. And I was up to the point where I had to just write the dissertation. So I didn't need to be in Austin. And the Hudson Institute, which at the time was headquartered in Indianapolis, had this fellowship called the Herman Kahn Fellowship that they offered to people who were writing their PhD dissertations. And I applied for and won. And they said, with the fellowship, you work half-time at Hudson headquarters and half-time you're supposed to work on your dissertation. And so really, having never been to Indianapolis, I agreed to go, and I lived there for over a year, and I really loved it. I had a great time there, and I did get my dissertation written, and I made a lot of good friends there, including our mutual friend Gary Geipel, but some other people who I'm still friends with to this day. So I really enjoyed my time in Indianapolis, and it's a terrific city. But when I was done with the dissertation, I ended up moving to Washington, in part because I was interested in federal government and all the things we've been talking about in this, but also because I was in my late 20s and unmarried. And at the time, it did not seem like there were that many single people in their late 20s in Indianapolis, and there were no apps that could help you meet them if they were there.
I should mention, he said the name of Dr. Gary Geipel, who I was a research assistant in the mid-90s at the Hudson Institute. He basically just gave me a bunch of books and said, read these and let me know what you think about them. And the Hudson Institute was located, if I have this right, at the old Fletcher Mansion from American Fletcher National Bank off of Emerson. It's this beautiful building, this beautiful home. I don't know what it is now, but you go, it's majestic. And you certainly felt smarter when you walked in the Hudson Institute.
Yeah, we called it the Castle. It was a great place to work. And there were tennis courts on the premises, and they had a nice dining room, and it was just a terrific think tank environment.
And Mitch Daniels had just left, I believe, had he not?
Yeah, and Les Lankowski, who still lives in the Indianapolis area, was the president of it, and later became a professor at IU. And it was just a great place to be around smart, thoughtful people who really cared about important policy issues, and I learned a lot from them.
Another one of Dr. Troy's books is What Jefferson Read, Ike watched and Obama tweeted 200 years of popular culture in the White House. And I'll post his website so you'll be able to look at all these books and purchase these books. But to me, the apex of popular culture in the White House is Nixon and Elvis. Is there anything that tops that in your mind? And more broadly speaking, what led you to write this book?
Yeah, I was always interested in how culture shapes presidents, what the things that are put in a president's head lead to policy, and how presidents approach governing, and how they approach their politics work. And so I started to write something about books presidents read, and then I took the same model and did it to what movies presidents watched. And then I had to give a speech at one point, and I combined the two. And somebody who was in the audience said, "Why don't you make a book out of this?" So I went beyond just movies and books, but also looked at plays and television, and looked at the evolution of culture in this country, largely through technological changes and improvements, and saw how that impacted the presidency, but also saw how it gave presidents opportunities to convey their thoughts to the American people. It's called What Jefferson read, Ike watched, and Obama tweeted, to show this evolution of technology. It was a kind of passive thing you could read, but the book you're reading is an inert thing, and the words come alive on the page, but it's just immobile. It is. And then later you have moving images in terms of Ike watching. And then later you have the ability to broadcast your own views to the American people, whether it's via radio or later television, and today via Twitter. So that evolution of technology and its impact on culture was the thing I studied in that book. And it was one of my favorite books that I've written, and it actually was a bestseller, and I really enjoyed that process. Would
Donald Trump have been president without Twitter?
No. I can give a longer answer, but it's a one-word answer.
No, I agree. And would he still be president without Twitter?
Oh, that's really interesting. It's actually an interesting thought. A friend of mine named Ken Baer, who worked in the Clinton and Obama White Houses, wrote a piece recently where he argued that presidents and their aides and people in the federal government just shouldn't tweet, and that you should take away their Twitter when they become president. And it's a pretty smart idea. And I think if Trump had lost his Twitter account, and if you just said presidents can't tweet, maybe he would have done a little better as president. He certainly said some outrageous and problematic things on Twitter, some of which led to his impeachment. That first accusation of Obama bugging him, I think, kind of led us down the path on the Russia investigation. So I think Twitter certainly caused him some problems. It is weird now how oddly silent he is. You take away Twitter and you almost hear nothing from him. And
do you think that he got a sense that much like FDR's fireside chats and Ronald Reagan's, I think they were Saturday morning radio addresses, and then you push forward to Donald Trump and Twitter, that they're trying to get around the national news media and talk directly to either Americans as a whole or their supporters specifically?
Absolutely. That is 100% the intent. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, before he was president, when he was governor, he used to speak on radio because he would get around the Republican editors of the major newspapers in New York. People who follow the media today know that it's really unlikely that editors of the major newspapers will be Republican today. But back then, that's what FDR was trying to get around, and he used radio to get directly to the American people. And it's basically the same principle that Donald Trump followed. He got around the media, and he went directly to the American people via his Twitter.
So much of the presidency and popular culture basically involves, whether it's a capital R or a lowercase r, metaphorically, the ridiculing of the president. Saturday Night Live has been masterful at this kind of, no matter where your parties are. I think they take harder swings at Republicans and Democrats, but that's even something that that was admitted by Saturday Night Live and its founder, that they take harder swings at Republicans because they just don't want to hear from their friends when they make fun of Democrats. But starting with Chevy Chase basically portraying Gerald Ford as a clumsy, bumbling idiot, all the way through Will Ferrell and George W. and Alec Baldwin. How important is it, and maybe it's not, for presidents to be made fun of in the popular culture so that they maybe stay humble or maybe understand that their power is somewhat limited?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I do talk about that exact development you're talking about with Saturday Night Live in my book, What Jefferson Read, Ike Watched, and Obama Tweeted. But in the 1960s, it was not cool and not allowed by the censors to mock presidents on TV. And there were a number of instances that I talk about in the book where people tried to make fun of, let's say, the Lyndon Johnson family, and it was not permitted. In the Kennedy administration, there was a guy named Vaughn Meader who used to do this impression of Kennedy. He was very gentle, but he had to do it via record albums and not on TV, because that's the way he was able to convey it, because he could get away around the censors. And there's a legendary Lenny Bruce joke that after Kennedy's tragic assassination in 1963, Lenny Bruce gets out there, completely silent audience. Everybody's upset about the assassination. And Lenny Bruce has this long, painful pause where he just sits there silently. And then finally he says, "Boy, Vaughn Meader is screwed." Because that was really the end of Vaughn Meader's career. And it's true, he became an alcoholic and died not long after. I mean, his career was over when Kennedy died. But over time, it became more acceptable to mock the presidents. And I think it's not coincidental that Saturday Night Live starts when there's a Republican in office, namely Gerald Ford, and they mock him. And then it's seen as something that they do. And so they did, they have mocked Democrats over the years. I think of Darrell Hammond, who would do his Clinton impersonation. But they're much, much more gentle on the Democrats. But I do think it's important for presidents to see how they are viewed. There's a famous story about Al Gore's terrible debate performance in 2000 when he was making eyes and rolling his eyes and making faces at George W. Bush. And Saturday Night Live mocked Gore for his performance in that debate. And Gore's staff shows him the mockery on Saturday Night Live so that he knows to dial it down a little bit in the subsequent debates. And he dials it down a little too much in the second debate. And then in the third debate, he kind of dials it up again and he stalks Bush on stage, and Bush gives him that famous head check that led to the American people saying, okay, we can have this guy as commander-in-chief, and helped Bush win a narrow election.
How much do presidents influence popular culture as opposed to just participating in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think that presidents can influence popular culture. You think about Bill Clinton putting on sunglasses and the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show. I think Obama is someone that there was a lot of cultural imitation of. I think specifically Clinton, also you look at the West Wing. I mean, that was a show based on a president that was a combination of Kennedy and Clinton without any of their flaws, right? So there's no womanizing on that show by the president, but he does all the other things that Kennedy and Clinton would do. So, yeah, I think that presidents can be hugely influential in pop culture.
We have the last few minutes here with Tevi Troy, who has written several books, and I want to get to your last one because I think the title itself is fascinating. Fight House: Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. I've had this discussion several times with reporters. A lot of the kind of, and not just reporters, but the common theme is, why can't the parties get along? Republicans and Democrats are always at each other's throats, and why don't you just come together and look past partisanship for your own sake and do what's best for the country? And my standard reply, which has never been refuted by anyone I've ever met in politics, and I've been doing this 20 plus years, right? I'm not that old, but I'm not that young. The real feuds are within the parties. They're not between the parties. It's Republicans and Republicans holding on to grudges for decades against each other, just like Democrats do against each other. I've never encountered it between the parties like I have the fights inside the family. How does that, or refute me, please, how does that come out in your book? And specifically, I would like you to address, if you could, the greatest intra-political feud of all time, and that's between Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to refute you because there's no refutation. The nastiest, bitterest, ugliest fights are between people on the same side. And that's what I talk about in the book Fight House, and that's what Fight House is really about. The fact that Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump don't like each other, big deal, right? I mean, the different parties are not supposed to like each other. They don't really interact much in social circles. They don't work in the same offices. And they actually went months at a time without talking. But in the White House, you're there. I mean, the West Wing is small. It's cramped, and you can't avoid people. And people who dislike you, they are, and whom you dislike, they're showing up in the same meeting over and over and over again. They're in your face. You see them all the time. And it leads to some real nastiness. So that's what Fight House is all about. And you're right that some of these feuds go on decades. Some of them go on across multiple administrations. Sometimes they go on past administrations. In fact, I just wrote an article for the DC Examiner this week about what happens to these feuds after an administration ends. Do you ever get reconciliation, or do you get continued hatred? And one story I tell is there was a guy named Robert Hartman, who was a very difficult character and was involved in many fights in the Ford administration. And Al Haig was briefly the chief of staff in the Ford administration. And I have the story there that 35 years after Haig was no longer chief of staff, after he no longer worked with Hartman, he could still get red-faced and sputtering mad if the name Hartman came up. So these grudges, they stay active for a long time. And try not to get involved in one because it doesn't go away so easily.
Well, a lot of these folks are in Washington for their whole lives, right? So I mean, there are plenty of people who worked in the Truman administration who end up advising Lyndon Johnson. I mentioned Clark Clifford earlier. Averell Harriman would be another one. It's the same thing. Reagan through the Bushes. And you mentioned the name of the author before so I'm going to ask you to do it again. Yes. If you love political history, it's a especially if you're a Democrat, but it doesn't matter. Buy the book Mutual Contempt. It's one of the best books I've ever read about modern political rivalry, and it's about the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Robert F. Kennedy. Dr. Troy, talk to me, please, a little bit about that rivalry and where you would put it on the spectrum of just true hatred.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about rivalries. I mean, the Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Kennedy is one of the stories I tell in Fight House, but I tell these stories across multiple administrations. And so there's many different stories. So if you kind of like that kind of political nastiness and rivalry, Fight House is the book for you. That rivalry between Johnson and Kennedy is not only one of the bitterest, but it's also one of the most consequential because it really shapes the 60s in so many ways. Bobby Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson from almost the first minute they met. I tell in the book the story about how Johnson came over, wanted to shake Kennedy's hand. Kennedy tried to snub him. Johnson wouldn't be snubbed and stood there until Kennedy finally reluctantly shook his hand. And that was kind of seen as a win for Johnson, but it was a loss, and that he made a bitter lifetime enemy in that moment in Robert F. Kennedy. And the famous line about Kennedy is from his father, Joseph Kennedy, who said, "Bobby's my boy. When he hates you, you stay hated." And boy, did Lyndon Johnson stay hated. But Johnson gave out his hatred as well. And Kennedy is initially on top in the JFK administration because he's the attorney general and Johnson's the kind of ineffectual vice president who is not given much to do. But then when John F. Kennedy is assassinated, suddenly Robert F. Kennedy is the attorney general for a president who doesn't much like him. And Kennedy's kind of on the bottom of the pile then. And then Kennedy leaves and runs for Senate, and Johnson is tormented by Kennedy. And throughout the Vietnam War, he's constantly thinking about what is Kennedy up to when he's trying to make his decisions about the Vietnam War. And he fears that if he pulls back in the Vietnam War, Kennedy is going to attack him from the right for being kind of a softie. But what actually happens is Johnson keeps pressing the case in Vietnam, and Kennedy ends up attacking him from the left for being hard-hearted and prosecuting this unwinnable war. And so Johnson's entire Vietnam strategy is colored by his looking over his shoulder at Robert F. Kennedy the entire time, and it is all based on this bitter, nasty, ugly rivalry that the two of them had.
Was there a president who didn't really have, or a rivalry, a White House that did a better job of kind of suppressing the rivalries? And I mean, I don't remember that Reagan had rivals. I mean, he ran against George H.W. Bush, who then served loyally for 8 years as president. But is there someone who's handled it better than others?
Well, so the first part of the question, has there been a White House without rivalries? The answer is no. Every White House has these fights, and that's what Fight House is all about. And I urge your listeners to go get a copy, because you will not find a boring administration if you're interested in fighting and rivalries. Do some administrations handle it better? I mean, you're right that in the Reagan administration, there was plenty of fighting, but Reagan kind of knew what he was doing. And Ed Meese, who is the representative of the conservatives, and Jim Baker was the representative of the so-called moderates, they worked together. They fought. Baker leaked against Meese. Meese kind of unilaterally didn't leak, but they were on opposite sides of things. But they were representing the two major perspectives within the conservative part, within the Republican Party, the conservative versus the moderate views. And I think it was important for Reagan to get those two perspectives. So I think Reagan is one who handled it a little better. I also talk about Bill Clinton, how he brought in, after the 1994 election loss when the Democrats lose both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years, Clinton brings in a more conservative advisor named Dick Morris. And Dick Morris is hated by George Stephanopoulos and the other liberal aides. But later, Stephanopoulos admits that having the more conservative perspective from Morris was actually helpful to Clinton getting better results from his staff. So, yeah, I think the best people are the ones who learn how to acknowledge that there will be rivalry, but manage it in an effective way as opposed to trying to suppress it.
Would you give Barack Obama high marks for managing it? He seemed to have done a pretty darn good job. For whatever reason, the infighting and the sort of post-presidential memoirs of staff and high-level executives doesn't seem to have been as prevalent as it has, say, for Nixon, Reagan, so on and so forth.
Yeah, look, Obama had this theory of no drama Obama. He didn't want to see fighting. He made it clear he didn't want to see fighting. He had a largely ideologically aligned staff, so there was less fighting. So, yeah, Obama was actively trying to suppress infighting. But there was plenty of fighting in the Obama administration, but his staff was just more disciplined about revealing it and not letting the word get out about it. And even throughout the Obama administration, if you asked somebody who worked there, they said, oh, no, we'll get along fine. But if you look at Fight House, if you look at my book, you'll see there's plenty of fighting. But I didn't really have access to the information about the fighting until after the administration ended.
Do you have a favorite post-presidential memoir? Let me say that a different way. Do you have a favorite book by a staff member involving a presidential administration, not from the president himself?
Yes. So the two best books I would recommend are All Too Human by George Stephanopoulos, which is a great look at the Clinton administration, and Stephanopoulos is honest, and in fact so honest that the Clinton staff who stayed on afterwards used to call him ABC News common traitor, George Stephanopoulos, because they didn't like the fact that he revealed so much.
Hey, I like that. That's I'll have to use that.
And then the other one is Marty Anderson's book Revolution, that tells about his time in the Reagan White House, but also gives a sense of the intellectual cross currents that were taking place in the late 70s and early 80s and bringing the conservative movement forward.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is historian and a PhD, Mr. Tevi Troy. You've been very, very kind. I've loved this. I got a million more questions, but we're going to end the podcast with the same 5 questions we ask everybody. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
What was your first job?
My first job was working at the American Enterprise Institute right out of college, and I worked for Ben Wattenberg, who was a Lyndon Johnson speechwriter.
Oh,
and I learned a ton from him.
I'm still amazed the fact that you took the train from Queens into Manhattan every day to go to school. How times have changed in American life.
By myself, hour and 15 minutes, no cell phone.
A second question, what was your first concert?
My first concert was REO Speedwagon and Cheap Trick at the Nassau Coliseum. And there was a guy with a mohawk in front of me. I was about 15 or 16 years old. And the guy with the mohawk in the middle of the concert turns around, puts his face in my face, and screams, yeah, 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 yeah. And my friends who were with me say I turned white when it happened. I was so terrified.
Hey, that's not a bad concert. That's not a bad first concert at all. Third question. These last three are going to be tough for you as a historian because they always are tough for historians. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I happen to love this book called Common Ground by J. Anthony Lukas. It's about busing in Boston, but there was a great blurb on the back of it which said, to say this book is about busing in Boston is like saying Moby Dick is about whaling in New Bedford. It's a book about how elites try to make policy decisions that they imposed on the rest of the people, and the people sometimes say, no, we don't want this.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, that is a tough one. I would like to see the giving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai to Moses. I think that would be a really great moment. See exactly what they look like, where there's kind of stone tablets, and then also see what happens when Moses comes down from the mountain and sees the Israelites worshiping the golden calf. Does he throw the tablets down? Does lightning strike the ground open? I'd love to see that.
I thought Cecil B. DeMille showed us all that. Am I wrong?
Well, that's one view of it.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Oh, that is a good one. I'm a little torn about this one. I think Bill Clinton would be fascinating and be a lot of fun to listen to. I'm also curious about Donald Trump. Not my cup of tea in terms of his communication style, but from what I hear, he's kind of a different person when you meet him privately. And I'd just like to gauge that contrast between the public persona and what he's like in private.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Dr. Tevi Troy. He's written several books. I will put the link to his website on the podcast posting so that you can take a look. Please support him in his efforts, as I wish you would support all historians. Thank you, Dr. Troy, for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.